Okay, so today is another practice session, and this will be just me. I'm Pranava, if you guys haven't done a session with me before. Um, so just some general information again, we are a nonprofit, and our main goal is to be a source of support as peers who have taken the MCAT relatively recently. So please reach out to us uh, whether it's through email or Slack. These sessions are recorded, so you can always refer back to them. And then our email is info@premedpeers.org. And then let us know if you're not in the email newsletter or listserv. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Okay, so this is the agenda for today. The assigned homework passages are CP and BB. It's fine if you didn't do them. And then the new passages are Psych Soc and CARS. So I put the CP passage link in the chat. It's the first one, so go ahead and click on it or just follow along on the screen. So does anyone want to read it, or I can just read it? Okay, so I'll go ahead and read it. Bone has a density of 2.4 grams per centimeters cubed as 2/3 of the mass of compact bone tissue, or which is 0.5 of the volume, is organic hydroxyapatite, which it has a chemical formula that is listed there. The rest of the compact bone consists of an organic material, mainly collagen, a fibrous protein possessing high elasticity. One group of researchers measured compact tibia bone and found that the high elasticity of collagen causes the tibia to have a spring constant of roughly 7.5 kilonewtons per millimeter when stretched from length L to length L plus delta T, as shown by figure 1. So the image shows stretching of bone, where A is the cross-sectional area of bone and F is the force per unit acting on bone. During bone breakage, two major factors need to be considered: stress and strain. Stress is given by equation 1, where F is force per unit area acting on bone, and A is the cross-sectional area over which the force is acting. Longitudinal strain is given by equation 2, which is the ratio of change in bone length relative to the existing bone length. So we have the equations for stress and strain, and then we have a figure showing dependent of stress on a bone on the longitudinal strain on a bone. Based on their analysis of the maximum energy that a bone can safely absorb before fracturing, researchers found that the point of fracture during the compression of a 0.2 meter bone was at a change in length of 4 millimeter. Does anyone have any questions on the passage before we move on to the questions? Okay. So first question, assume that when a 50 kg woman falls, the energy from the fall is distributed only to a 0.2 meter long tibia bone. Based on the values given in the passage, what is the maximum height from which the woman can fall and fracture her tibia? Does anyone have any ideas of how they would get this started? Okay, then I will jump ahead to the answer. So the point of fracture is 4 millimeters per 0.2 meters of bone. So actually, sorry, I'll delete that. That's irrelevant. So what you need to do here is calculate elastic potential energy. And then from that, calculate your gravitational potential energy to solve for height. So you calculate your elastic potential energy as 1/2 kx squared. Sorry, so the first point was relevant because the question asks about where can the women fall and what is the minimum height that can cause a fracture of her tibia. So the point of fracture, which means like anything before won't cause a fracture and anything at that exact point will be the minimum point of fracture. So that's where you get your 4 millimeters. And you plug in that 4 millimeters into your x in 1/2 kx squared. And then the k you get from the passage where it says in the first paragraph, in the last sentence, spring constant of roughly 7.5 kilonewtons per millimeter. So that's your K. And then once you plug that stuff in, you get 60 kilonewtons times millimeters. And like I said, set your elastic potential energy equals gravitational potential energy because conservation of energy laws. And then once you set mgh, because you're trying to solve for h in gravitational potential energy, and sorry, this is another typo. This should be 60 because it should be equal to that 60. Let me actually just change it. Wait, no, sorry about that. Okay, so now that you have elastic gravitational potential energy equals 60 kilonewtons times millimeters, solve for h. So it'd be 60 divided by mg, m is 50, g is just gravity, 10 meters per second square as always, and then you would get 60,000 newtons because you're converting kilonewtons to newtons, divided by 500 newtons will give you 120 millimeters, which is 12 centimeters. Any questions on this? Okay. So then what is the mass of hydroxyapatite in 10 centimeters of compact bone? Give you guys a couple seconds to think about it, and then if you have any ideas, put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going with the explanation. But these sessions are meant to be highly interactive. So even if you are lost, like just hearing where you are at will help, and like letting me know that will help me teach you rather than you just passively listening to my answer explanations. So even if you think you have no idea, at least share something if you're comfortable doing that so we can work more collaboratively rather than just me lecturing at you. Okay. So here's the answer, and then what you need to understand is that you're given mass of you're given volume of compact bone, and then in the passage you're given the density of compact bone. So then you get the mass of compact bone. So doing 2.4 times 10 gives you 24 grams of bone. And then in the passage, it tells you 2/3 of massive compact bone is hydroxyapatite. So then you do 2/3 times 24 equals 16 grams. I'll let you guys digest that for a couple seconds and then I'll move on. Which of the following graphs shows the relationship between the extent to which compact bone is stretched and the force produced by that stretched bone? I'm going to ask you guys to at least take a guess on this one and put an answer in the chat. So we have two obvious shape differences, right? The top ones are a curve, and then the bottom ones are a straight line. So just take a guess between each of them. At least tell me which shape you think is correct, the curve or the straight line. Okay, A. So the answer is actually D, and that's fine. Thank you for participating. Is because the force in the passage is told to be 7.5 kilonewtons per millimeters, right? So when you have 10 millimeters on your x-axis over here, you actually do 7.5 kilonewtons per millimeters times 10 millimeters to get you 75 kilonewtons. So that's why the y-axis should be 75 at the top when you're at 10 millimeters rather than 7.5. So that's how you get rid of A and B. So once you check that, what's left is again the issue of the shape of the curve. So then the next issue is that, is it a line or is it a curve? So then the reason why it's D is because we are looking at Hooke's law here, which is force equals KD or force equals KX, where D or X stands for like compression distance. So K is a constant and F is going to be directly proportional to D or X as a result. So force should be directly proportional to compression distance, which means that this shape should be a line because in reference to the graph, K represents the slope and K is a constant. So slope is a constant, which will give you a line rather than a curve. Okay, perfect. Next question, which of the following is most likely true regarding figure 2? Deformed bone obeying Hooke's law corresponds with region 0 to 1. Deformed bone obeying Hooke's law corresponds with region 1 to 2. I'll put up the graph so you can look at it. And then deformed bone obeying Hooke's law corresponds with region 0 to 2. Deformed bone obeys Hooke's law only after region 2. So I think this one's a hard question, so I'm going to jump to the explanation. X-axis shows strain, which is a ratio of change in like the bone. So you can kind of think of it as compression distance. And then y-axis shows stress, which is force acting on bone. So you can think of that as F, force. So Hooke's law would be when K is constant. So again, when the line has a constant slope, because K should be constant, and that would be only between 0 and 1. Yeah, the key here is recognizing that strain is kind of like a stand-in for compression and stress is a stand-in for force. And the way you understand that is by reading the passage where it says, so for stress, it's force per unit area, and then strain is change in bone length. So it's making those connections between Hooke's law and then these new kind of variables that they give you, but they are very related to like what the Hooke's law variables are. If you just slow down and read the relation of these two things to Hooke's law variables. Which of the following is, oh, we just did this? Okay. The last question on this passage. Researchers created a synthetic form of bone which is perfectly elastic and measured its tensile properties. The results are shown below. Based on the results, how much work must be performed on the bone while stretching it to a length of 2.5 millimeters? So when you're thinking work and you know you need to calculate it, what variables are you going to be looking for? So do you know any of the formulas for work? Okay, force times distance. How about work equals change in energy as well? So good thinking with the force times distance one. Unfortunately, this is not something that got me as well, but you actually don't have force. Um, yeah, yeah. Okay, so you do. Let's see how you use that force times distance equation. So the way they had it is because work equals force times distance. I don't know how to use that. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused. Mhm. Sorry, give me a second to like, figure this out. Um, okay, so the problem with using force times distance is that that is an equation used when work is applying a force to move an object. Um, but in the case of like a spring, when you have elastic kinetic energy, you actually need to use the theorem work equals change in energy. So then work equals change in elastic energy, which is 1/2 kx squared. But then you don't have K because you are given the K of natural bone in the passage, so don't get caught by that because this is synthetic bone. So then what you need to do is rearrange it into 1/2 kx times x, where kx is force, and you do have force at 2.5 millimeters. And then you just look on the graph to see at 2.5 millimeters, x equals 2.5 millimeters, and then f equals 100, and then use that equation to do work equals 1/2 100 times 2.5. Okay, for this one, I'm gonna have you guys go ahead and open the link so you can have answers for me and we can get a little bit more participation in. Let me know when you're done by putting it in the chat that you have answered the questions and have answers ready to go when we go over the questions. Oh, I'm so sorry, I missed your message. All right, let's get started then. Okay, what did you get for this one then? Okay, perfect. That's correct. So this is like a diagram that they have in the answer explanation. So directional selection is when you're picking for one extreme of the population, which if you look back in the passage, third strategy, right? So third strategy is breeding against stereotypic behaviors. So if you're selecting against one extreme, which is stereotypic behaviors, and you're selecting for the other extreme, basically. According to the opening sentence of the passage, animals kept in captivity most likely are at increased risk of what? Random variations in allelic frequencies, variations in allelic frequencies caused by natural selection, increased rates of heterozygosity, or increased occurrence of random mutations. Did you guys get anything for this one? Okay, great. So it's because you have a very limited population. Endangered animals are in the bottlenecking event. So when they have a really small number of individuals in the species, you have a reduction in the different allele copies available. So if like one animal dies off, that causes a really uh, impactful shift in the variations in the allelic frequencies, because the frequencies are like in terms of percent over the total. So when you have one animal die off in a large population, it doesn't really make a big difference. But when you have a small population, it does make that really big difference. Okay, which of the following statements best describes the data in table 1? I'm just going to show the table here, but can you guys explain what part of the table you would look at to come to this answer conclusion? Um, yes, perfect. And then so when you have a decrease in heterozygosity, it means your population is becoming less varied. So when you have inbreeding, that same thing happens where your population gets more and more similar to each other. And that's a problem because you need variation in order to have a healthy population so you don't accumulate harmful mutations. So when you have a decrease, that's what the negative means. In multilocus heterozygosity, your population is becoming more similar, and the place and the protocol in which you see this happening the most is DOC, because that's where you have the greatest decrease in variation. Okay, and what about this one? Passage reference to relaxed natural selection is most likely referring to a lack of random mating, a lack of predation, a lack of competition between members of the same species. Which one of these did you guys put? And okay, yeah, I found this one really confusing too, and I wouldn't honestly worry about it too much. It's not a concept that I actually ever saw in any practice tests or materials, and I did all of the AMC UWorld, and I took like a bunch of other practice tests. But their explanation for this was like, I'll show you. Sorry, give me a second. So their explanation was that random mating occurs when there is a lack of sexual selection. And sexual selection is when species preferentially mate. So sorry, 2 and 3 are characteristics of sexual selection. So when you have competition, that's like individuals fighting amongst themselves, like who they're gonna mate with, and then a predation kind of eliminates the weaker animals, so it's also a form of selection. Um, so in sexual selection, you don't have random mating, whereas in natural selection, you do have a lack of predation and a lack of competition because it's the opposite of sexual selection. So natural selection is when certain traits are selected over time, but when you have relaxed natural selection, which they don't actually define too much, and that's kind of annoying, but it's talking about the second paragraph where it says relaxed natural selection can rapidly deplete genetic diversity in captive population. Um, Conservationists need tools to prevent adaptation to captivity. However, breeding captive species in ways that minimize GD loss to the captive environment is costly and complicated. So this is implying that in captivity, natural selection doesn't happen in the same way. So you don't have that predation and competition that you would have in a natural environment. So relaxed natural selection is lacking characteristics that normal natural selection has. Uh, so I was talking about the practice test from the AMC where there's 5 of them in total. And there's a bunch of other third-party ones, which I don't think there's like ones that are particularly better than the other ones, but the AMC are a must-have. Okay, last question for this one, which is not a requirement that needs to be met for a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the 5 tenets are no mutations, so get rid of C, no net migration, so get rid of A, no natural selection, so get rid of D, and then the 2 other ones are no sexual selection and population has to be sufficiently large. So this is mostly just a content/memorization thing. All right, any question on that passage before we move on to the next one? Okay, so then for this one, I'm gonna do the same thing, have you guys read it on your own, and then we can come back and talk about it, because I feel like that worked better. Again, do the same thing, like when you're done reading, put it in the chat. Okay. So, first question. A symbolic interactionism theorist suggests that the latter findings of study 2 are explainable by the concept of medicalization. Which of the following statement aligns with this perspective? So I'll go back and actually look at that latter finding. Study 2. Okay. Study 2, latter study is that embarrassment and discomfort during, I don't think it's that one. So okay, I'll actually just go ahead and read the whole study because it's kind of hard to tell where the breakdown is. So, study 2 investigated whether language proficiency is a potential contributor to ethnic disparities in mental health care in Asian and Latino immigrant communities in the U.S. English proficient and less English proficient individuals with mental disorders were surveyed, and researchers found that compared to EP individuals, LEP individuals with mental disorders were less likely to self-identify a need for mental health services, experienced a longer duration of untreated disorders, and used fewer healthcare services. Receipt of minimally adequate care did not differ significantly by language proficiency. Minimally adequate care was defined for individuals who had access treatment within the past 12 months as 8 or more visits to a psychotropic or psychotherapeutic service. Embarrassment and discomfort during visits were not common among LEP individuals. Perceived need for embarrassment predicted lifetime healthcare use, whereas embarrassment and discomfort did not. Did you guys put anything for this one? Okay. Yep, so that is correct. Oh, that is not correct. Wait, let me check if this is right. I feel like it is A. Sorry, let me check on this. Yeah, okay, sorry. So let me change that. So A is correct because social interactionism explains how people's like meaning of certain things, like they attach meaning to symbols or objects or behaviors, affects the way we function in society. So here we're talking about medicalization, which is understanding that a certain thing is an illness or sick behavior, whereas other things are not. So medicalization is the process of identifying something as an illness that was previously not recognized as a medical problem. So here that it's relevant because language barriers prevent the LEP individuals from understanding that mental health is an issue that needs to be addressed. So that is talking about the part where it says LEP individuals with mental disorders were less likely to self-reflect and self-identify a need for mental health services. So that is their inability to understand that this is a mental illness because they don't have the language or cultural capital to understand it, whereas the English proficient individuals might have that. All right, next one. Which perspective partly explains the disparities between individuals in cognitive ability during study 1? So let's go back to study 1. It's talking about assessing Mexican American immigrants and their children's between mono or bilingualism and cognitive ability. Bilingualism may modulate cognitive ability in older individuals, particularly those with lower formal education and poor socioeconomic status. These findings persisted after statistical adjustment for demographic factors, and people who are monolingual showed greater rates of decline. Okay, so what did you guys put for this one? Okay, also A, that is correct. And this is the part where it's talking about how the impact is more pronounced in those with lower incomes. So that's all you had to catch. Third, the statistical adjustment performed during study one most likely accounted for all of the following factors. So this is the part where it's talking about statistical adjustment for demographic factors. So what did you put for this one? Okay, great. Do you just want to say a little bit about why you picked that one? She said D, which is correct. Okay, no worries. So we're talking about accounting for demographic factors. So that would be like identity, immigration status, income, and age. So you want to control for confounding variables. So these demographic factors could be confounding variables, but cognitive ability is actually your dependent variable that you're measuring. So you would not control for that. That's what you're measuring as well. So two ways to look about it. Cognitive ability is not a demographic factors, and you also would not adjust for your dependent variable because that's the thing you need to measure. Okay. Lastly, the final sentence of the passage supports which of the following statements. So let's go back to the final sentence. Embarrassment and discomfort, or sorry, not that one. Perceived need for treatment predicted lifetime mental health care use, whereas embarrassment and discomfort did not. But which one of these aligns with perceived need for mental illness care or embarrassment and discomfort? Is that social capital, cultural capital, individual discrimination, or institutional discrimination? No, so it's actually B. There's nothing talking about individual discrimination. So that would be like someone being racist to another individual, whereas institutional discrimination would be like policing policies that target one race over another. So the way cultural capital relates to this is that the ability to understand that mental illness is something you need to seek care for, that's know-how or like knowing what you need. So cultural capital is defined as know-how or let's see what other words they use for it. They call it know-how, information about things you need to know, titles, symbolic property, education, and basically knowledge about what you need in your to like live a successful and healthy life. So awareness that you need mental health care is cultural capital. Social capital is knowing people, but it doesn't talk about like if you know people have mental illness, you're more likely to seek care for it, whatever. So this is about having knowledge, and that reflects cultural capital the best. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Last question. The findings of study one support the which kind of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and why? So study one says it's talking about like how bilingualism affects cognitive decline, and the conclusion is that monolingual people had greater rates of cognitive decline. And and it's saying bilingualism modulates cognitive ability. So those are the two conclusions. So which one would that go with? Do you have a guess for this one? Yeah. So this is A is correct because the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says language determines cognition like fully, whereas the weak one says language impacts or is another factor that influences cognition. So the study one is definitely not that intense where it's saying language totally determines cognitive characteristics, but it does mention how bilingualism modulates cognitive decline. So that's the same thing as saying influences it. So that was the last question. We don't have time to do the last passage, which is fine. You guys can do that on your own once the slides will be linked to you. And then if you have any questions, you can email us. But in these last 5 minutes, I will stop recording and then, well, first, do you guys have any questions on the passages? Okay, then I will stop recording. Actually, let me do this one last slide before I stop recording. Okay, so this is just our information again. Our email is info@premedpeers.org.